This is Floss Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. This week, Jonathan Bennett and I are talking with Kyle Rankin, my old colleague from Linux Journal. Kyle knows like everything, but the cool thing is he's not only written like 12 books already, he just wrote a book on how to write a tech book. It's really good, and he is really thorough on what we need to do. If you've ever been tempted to write a book, or even if you should be tempted to write a book, and maybe you should, especially if you're technical, you might be qualified. Listen to this show or watch it, whichever works for you. That is coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Floss Weekly, episode 749, recorded Wednesday, September 13th, 2023. That's in Chapter 3. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Discourse, the online home for your community. Discourse makes it easy to have meaningful conversations and collaborate anytime, anywhere. Visit discourse.org/twit to get 1 month free on all self-serve plans. And by our friends at IT Pro TV, now called ACI Learning. ACI's new cyber skills is training that's for everyone, not just the pros. Visit go.acilearning.com/twit. Twit listeners will receive at least 20% off or as much as 65% off an IT Pro Enterprise Solution Plan after completing their form. You'll receive a proper quote based on the size of your team. Hello again, everyone, everywhere. This is Floss Weekly. I am Doc Searls, and this week I am joined by Jonathan Bennett himself.
Hey, Doc. It is great to be here.
And great to be here too, wherever this is. It's like the great here, the great here that is where you are in your head, listener or viewer, in your eyeballs. Somebody told me recently that the eyeballs are the part of the brain you can see. And I haven't been able to get that out of my mind ever since.
That's not wrong.
It's not wrong. Your eardrums are kind of hidden way in there, so you're not looking at those. Your brain is looking at me. Stop it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so our guest this week is Kyle Rankin. Are you familiar with Kyle? I am very, but you probably may not be.
I am not. I've never talked to him before, except the quick pre-show we've had. Seems like a nifty guy. I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to talk about. Writing tech books. I think he wrote a tech book about writing tech books, which is sort of inception.
That's right. That's kind of a fourth wall-y sort of thing. And I've just known Kyle. I mean, we were colleagues at Linux Journal for many years, and I just knew Kyle as kind of, this is a Dune reference, is sort of our mentat on the staff. He knew so much and could solve so many things and was a jack of so many trades, as well as a good writer, that I think any single description doesn't do him fair. So I'm gonna read off what he sent me, but probably not the entire paragraph because it's a lot. Technologist, author, FOSS advocate, speaker, 2 decades of professional Linux experience, blah, blah, blah. Author of a dozen books on security and open source software, including How to Write a Tech Book and Linux Hardening in Hostile Networks. That sounds like Combat Ready or something. Award-winning columnist and tech editor for Linux Journal, and has spoken at many things. I think it was at FOSDEM. He gave a great talk. Was that at FOSDEM? I'll just bring him in. Hey, Kyle. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
What was that we were at in Bristol in the UK?
Oh, that was Freenode Live.
Freenode. Okay, yeah. Freenode Live. That's Freenode is an IRC, and we have one of those going in the background here too. So welcome to the show. Welcome to the show. So what is the latest book? Give me the premise about that.
Sure. Yeah. So the latest book is called How to Write a Tech Book. It's a tech book about how to write a tech book. The entire thing is very meta from the beginning to the end. It started,
not to be confused with the company, right?
Exactly. Not to be. Has no relation to the company. And it's not virtual reality. So, so it started when I was actually working on a separate book that I published earlier this year. It's been a busy year as far as my writing goes. And I wanted to collect all of my old Linux journal articles that I still found relevant. And so I took all of because I refer to them all the time still, even to this day, even though some of the articles may be up to 10 years old, sometimes when you're wondering, how do I do XYZ? And you remember, oh, wait, I wrote about that in Linux Journal, back in 2003 or whatever, so you go find that article. Well, I know where they are because I wrote them, but I don't think a lot of other people, can instantly remember where this article is. So I decided to compile all of that into a book that I ended up calling like the best of hack and slash. And in the process of doing that, I wanted to, it wasn't an ideal book for a traditional publisher to take on because we're republishing old articles, that sort of thing. So I thought, I'm going to try out this self-publishing thing for the first time and climb this learning curve along the process, including at one point, needing to create a print-ready proof of the book. And so I gave myself a weekend crash course in LaTeX to format this. And so I was at this crossroads at the time where I could either learn something like Adobe InDesign or Scribus, or maybe Scribus, but it's basically a GUI program to do print-ready formatting, or I could learn LaTeX, which let me do it in Vim. And so to me, it was a clear and obvious choice. So I ended up going with LaTeX, spent the weekend, gave myself a crash course, found an excellent book template, and then was able really quickly actually to format and lay out a professional looking book that met my standards, having worked with a lot of traditional publishers over the years. After I did that, I was telling some friends and colleagues about it. I think 3 times in one day, I got the same question. Well, are you going to write up how you did that? Because they were all sort of interested. Well, how do you do that? And after the third person, I realized, I think there's a book there. And so I realized, well, it shouldn't just be like a self-publishing book or just a book on how to format something in LaTeX. But instead, what I did was I sort of compiled everything I know about writing technical books, going back many years, going back, like 10, 12 books ago, into a volume that guides people through the process. Because I realized there's a lot of people that could write a book, could write a technical book in particular, but it's almost like, for example, I only got into the industry because I knew somebody essentially that guided me along the process and invited me in to this world. But there's a lot of people that don't have that, and it shouldn't necessarily be that way. So I wanted to write a guide for someone who has a tech book in them to write, but doesn't know where to start. And it just sort of walks you through everything from the idea all the way through, reprints and second and third editions.
So I'm curious about a lot of things about this actually, but what service do you use to publish then if you're self-published? Is that Amazon? I think Amazon offers this. Is that what you went with?
Amazon does offer. There's a number of services out there that you can choose. Amazon's one of them. There is Lulu. There is Ingram Spark, I want to say. It's in the book, but I think that's the name as well. There's a couple of there's a lot of self-publishing options out there that are strictly ebook only. But I wanted to have the option. There's a couple of criteria for me personally. I wanted to have ebook as an option, but I wanted to have, more importantly for me, I wanted physical, tangible books that customers could buy as an option. And so I looked at all of the providers out there. And at least for me personally, I went with Lulu because it did a couple of things that I wanted, which was, one, they provided the e-commerce site for me so that I didn't have to set one up. Even though I know how to set it up, I didn't want the hassle of building my own e-commerce platform for this book. So they provided that. They provide all of the print-on-demand, linking you into all of the print-on-demand suppliers that they have to print all kinds of different types of books. So in my case, I went with a standard sort of soft cover tech book format that you might see, like an A5 paper size, and then also a what I call the premium hardcover. So we sort of went all out with, turned all the dials up on the premium hardcover for people who really like the feel and smell of a book, and care about things like paperweight. and stuff, I figured, well, there's some of those like myself out there, and they're willing to pay a little bit more for a book that has all of that. So I turned all the Lulu knobs up for that book, but then had the sort of default settings for the paperback, and then also had a ebook. So yeah, I went with them. The other criteria I had was I wanted the ability to be on sites like Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And Lulu offers that as well. So I like the idea of being independent from just being Amazon only. But I also wanted to have a presence on Amazon. So Lulu seemed to tick all the boxes for me as far as that goes, because they have what they call global distribution, where when you set up a book project, you can say, I want this to be distributed not just on Lulu's own site where people can go buy it, but I also want it shared for sale on Barnes and Noble, Amazon, and all these other partners that they have partnerships with.
If you don't mind my asking, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but what does the initial investment look like on that to get published through Lulu? And what's your progress on trying to make that back?
The initial investment's mostly time. So it's not, that's one of the other benefits of it, is that it's not that expensive. So my very first book that I published, so I published 2 books on Lulu now this year. The first one was that Best of Hack and Slash book that I talked about, where I combined all those articles. That one, the articles were already written, so I didn't even have the time outlay of having to write them, right? They had already been written and edited. I just had to compile them and then format them. So I actually went from conception to a published book in less than a month.
Oh my goodness.
Because the articles were already, how do you publish a book in under a month? Well, you have it already written. That helps a lot. And because it was already edited, I didn't really need to worry about the editing. I just needed to spend personal time learning how to do print proof formatting. Now, when you're writing a tech book, you already have to concern yourself a lot with formatting. I liken it somewhere in between writing a how-to book and writing an academic paper. Where academic papers, the formatting is everything, and there's very strict rules on how to do formatting and how to do, footnotes and all of that stuff. Tech books sort of sit in the middle, where if you're reading a tech book, you may not realize you're doing this because it talks to your brain directly. You may not notice all of this minute formatting that goes into a code block, for instance, where certain things are bolded, certain things are italic, certain things aren't. And, and why is that? And all of it's to sort of subtly guide your brain into knowing what is a command I'm supposed to type in a terminal, for instance, which variables are truly variable, which should be typed in verbatim, all of that stuff. So I'd already done all of that because that's just part of writing a tech book for a traditional publisher. But yeah, it was the extra parts that took time, from learning how to take all of that and then have a print-ready proof that is ready to send to a publisher to print in PDF form. So that took a couple of weeks. But yeah, so as far as the cost, it was the cost of getting a couple of print samples sent to me. So we're talking, I don't know, like maybe, $20, I would say, something like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because because you're not, you're selling the book for more than it costs you to print. And when you buy a print proof from Lulu for yourself, they only charge you the print cost. And part of the requirement for shipping, for distributing through Amazon and the others, is to, once you have it uploaded, you need to print and you need to get them to publish an actual copy and send it to you for review to catch mistakes. And then once you approve that, then it gets sent out for Amazon and everyone else, which is good because I found mistakes.
Of course.
Yeah.
It happens all the time. And Lulu prints on demand?
It's print on demand. Yeah.
Awesome.
So there's certainly pros and cons with that, and different print on demand. I mean, it's a lot better these days than what I hear it used to be as far as quality and consistency goes. They've been pretty good about it. I mean, that said, it's whenever you're printing a one-off compared to, say, printing off 10 of something or 20 of something, it's a lot easier for inconsistencies to show up. Usually it's nothing like I've only run into a couple of mistakes that I thought were big deals but they're really good about that sort of thing. If somehow there's a print error and it crosses a threshold, they're for both the customer and you as the author, they will ship a replacement. But for the most part, it's been good quality. It's especially the premium hardcover. I was really pleased with how that came out because it's on heavier weight paper, and and the hardcover itself feels really nice and tangible.
So I have some further questions on on Lulu and using Lulu and actually the history of Lulu. But first, I have to let everybody know that this episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Discourse, the online home for your community. For over a decade, Discourse has made it their mission to make the internet a better place for online communities. By harnessing the power of discussion, real-time chat, and AI, Discourse makes it easy to have meaningful conversations and collaborate with your community anytime and anywhere. Would you like to create a community? Visit discourse.org/twit to get 1 month free on all self-serve plans. Trusted by some of the largest companies in the world, Discourse is open source and powers more than 20,000 online communities. Whether you're just starting out or want to take your community to the next level, there's a plan for you. A basic plan for a private invite-only community, a standard plan if you want unlimited members and a public presence, a business plan for active customer support communities. Jonathan Belava, developer advocacy lead at Twitch, says, Discourse is the most amazing thing we have ever used. We have never experienced software so reliable, ever. One of the biggest advantages to creating your own community with Discourse is that you own your data. You will always have access to all your conversation history, and Discourse will never sell your data to advertisers. Discourse makes everything you need in one place. So make Discourse the online home for your community. Visit discourse.org/twit to get 1 month free on all self-serve plans. That's discourse.org/twit. So Kyle, I just want to close an interesting loop here, which is that the very first editor for Linux Journal was Bob Young. He left after a month or two and went off to start Red Hat. And then when he left Red Hat, he went off to start Lulu. so here we are. So I want to ask when I want to ask something about the writing discipline. I mean, you've done a whole lot of books at this point. How do you get down to, I mean, I imagine knowing that you can get this to publication faster without a lot of the hassle one normally does must help the process of anticipating what's going on. But I'm wondering how you must have some method that you use to kind of make it all happen.
I do, yeah. And in fact, even in the book, there's an entire chapter just dedicated to the writing process and talking about some of the different approaches that both I've taken and that I know other people take to write, because everyone's a little bit different. I mean, even I find myself changing my habits a little bit over time. But like the very first thing is just figuring out the time you're going to write. That's probably the most important part of it to start off with, because for the most part, especially if you're writing a tech book, most people who are writing a tech book already have some sort of day job in technology, which is what's, feeding them all of this information they're going to write about. And so if you already have a full-time job, finding that extra time to write, in particular, having focused time that is more than just a half an hour or an hour block, which is important, can be tricky. And so first you have to figure out, well, when do I have time to write, and what times of day are best suited for me to write. And of course, this has changed for me personally back when I was just with my wife before we had a child. Once we had a child, then that sort of thing has changed. My wife's also a writer, and so if both of us were working on books at the time, then wouldn't be a big deal for example, a weekend. We both say, well, we're both going to go back into our offices this weekend and both work really hard on our books. But when you have a child, that obviously is not going to work very well. So as a result, that changes the calculus, right? So that's more of a case of, okay, well, I'm going to take this block of time on Saturday, but then not this block of time, that sort of thing. So that sort of first is just making the time to write. And then for me, the biggest help that I found is writing a very good outline. Over time, I've discovered how much I rely on a good outline. I mean, to the point I have a whole chapter just on writing the outline because it's that important. So what a good outline does, and before I write the book, I sit down and plot out every chapter, as best I can think of, every primary header, like every primary section within a chapter. and then sometimes go down into a subsection level, even if I feel that is necessary. And in addition to that, the outline also has a paragraph summary of here's what the chapter's about. Here's an introduction to the chapter explaining it. So this isn't just useful for me. This also feeds directly into the book pitch that you will inevitably send to publishers to try to get them to take your book. But when I sit down to write a chapter, what I do, the very first thing I do is I open a file for the chapter. Then I open up my outline and I copy that entire section from the outline about that chapter into the chapter. And these days, because I do it this way, I actually mark up my outline, not as in, a numbered list, but I mark it in Markdown according to headers and subheaders and things like that, because that's how I write that's how I do a very light formatting of my drafts before I go into the heavier duty formatting. And what that allows me to do is I copy in the structure from the outline, and then I have a skeleton that I now just have to add flesh to. And so I start with the very first paragraph. I reread the first paragraph, which reminds me what this chapter's about. And you might think, well, why would you need to do that? You know what the chapter's about. Well, that might be true when you first wrote the outline, but a month or two later, after you've written other chapters, and now you're on chapter 5. And it helps to be reminded, what was my full intention for this chapter? Like, what was I trying to say? What was the point? All of that. And you get that in your mind. And the other benefit of doing it this way is that first paragraph that summarizes every chapter in a tech book needs to begin with an introduction that tells the reader, here's what this chapter's about. Here's what we're going to cover in this chapter. And that paragraph is the seed that then becomes the full introduction to the chapter. So you start with that, you flesh out the introduction perhaps, and then I just go header by header. And okay, header 1 says I'm going to talk about this. Let's write that section. Then now I finish that. Now I'm on to header 2, and it says now I'm going to be writing about this. Then I start working on that. But what happens is you'll start working on that, and you'll find yourself slowing down and procrastinating a little bit at some point, or having some difficulty thinking about how to approach the next part. And whenever that happens to me, what I realize is I've taken on too much at once. I've tried to bite off too much of the elephant, as it were. And what you need to do is that it tells me I need to now split up whatever I'm working on right now into subsections. So whenever it seems overwhelming, or I find myself procrastinating, then it means, okay, well, I'm focusing on a first top level header and topic. I need to split this topic into subtopics now. And I just split it into smaller and smaller chunks until it's manageable again. And then it flows at that point. It's amazing how fast it flows when you do it that way. And again, if you find it not flowing quickly, it's because it's too big. You're thinking of something too big to focus on. And before you know it, if you do it that way, you finish a subsection. Oh, I'm finished the subsection for this main section. Now I'm on to the next one. And then you break that through. And before you know it, you're at the end of the chapter. And like, okay, well, now I need to move on. Now, for some books, for most tech books, there's also lab work involved that you have to factor in. A book about writing a book had very minimal lab work involved. But what I mean by lab work is if you're writing about, say, writing software, or you're writing about how to set up a Linux server or whatever, you have to set up some sort of lab where you're testing all of your steps out and making from a very vanilla environment just to make sure that what you're saying is accurate. And that takes time too that you have to factor in, and that can certainly slow you down. And you have to figure out ways to balance writing about something with going through the steps of doing it so that neither one slows down the other too much.
Wow. So talking about outlines, we're all taught in school to hate outlines. I think that's one of the things. I don't know if they did. They certainly, when I was growing up, said we have to write with an outline or organize your work into an outline. And most kids are just bored to death by it. But back in the late 80s and early 90s, on the Mac anyway, there was this app called More, which is an outlining app that was also a word processor. It was fabulous. I used it all the time. And I could move headers in an outline up and down. I could move them in and out, and then add text under all of them. I haven't used Markdown that much, and I seem to be Markdown is mostly a formatting thing, similar to HTML in a way, but sort of optimized for GitHub or for Git in general, I guess. I don't know, but I'm wondering if there's some in writing, is there some, especially in the open source world, something closer to WYSIWYG that one can use outlining with?
I mean, I don't typically do a lot of WYSIWYG types. I mean, I write, all of my writing has been done in a text editor, in particular in Vim.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But the reason I pick Markdown in particular is I found the process of the other way to do it, and I've mentioned this in the book, is to get a word processor and use a publisher's template. Publishers all have templates that they use for formatting all of the writing. You could very, very well use a word processor, but the reason I like using raw text and Markdown in particular is that it's very fast and lightweight, and visually it makes sense as far as when you're reading text. For example, in italics in Markdown is you put an asterisk on either side of the text, just like if you're chatting with somebody. That's very convenient because formatting really, when you get into deep formatting of tech books, it bogs you down and slows you down. It takes a separate part of your brain and a separate type of focus. And if you're trying to write the book itself, if you get too caught up in the formatting, you'll go into a rabbit hole where you're tweaking and tuning and getting it to look just right. And it takes your focus away from the text. I've found that by using something like Markdown, all I really want to do when I'm using Markdown in text, there's very little Markdown in my first drafts. It's simply to remind myself of my intentions. So I'm writing a word, oh, I want that to be italic in the final version. Let me put that there. Or I want this to be a second level header. I need to do something to make sure that I note that. I used to use HTML to do this, but I found writing all those extra tags in between was cumbersome. So with Markdown, it's, you can replace typing a bunch of tags with a couple of characters. So it's just faster. But yeah, I found that to be very effective because I don't need to have perfect formatting in my first drafts because I'm not to that stage yet. I just need to remind myself, future me, of what I intended to do, because I've run into this before where I haven't done that. And I look at a header, I'm like, was that a first level header, a second level header, a third level header? Then I have to reread, we're talking a month or two later when I go back to format a draft that I've written. And then I have to basically reread that whole section and put it back into my brain and think about, okay, well, was that part of this other section, or where does it belong? If I don't do it that way.
So I think it fits well with this. We mentioned earlier LaTeX, and I bet a lot of people don't know what that is or even how it's spelled. Can you give us the quick answer to what LaTeX is and why you need it?
Sure, yeah. So LaTeX is a text formatting language. It's based off of TeX, T-E-X, which was created by Donald Knuth to format text. And it was expanded into LaTeX, L-A-T-E-X, which a lot of people say latex, which is fine. Like with everything else in open source, in FOSS, there's like 5 different pronunciations. You can get in great holy wars about which one's right. But if you want to be fancy, you can say LaTeX, which is my understanding is how it's officially pronounced. But in any case, it's spelled L-A-T-E-X. However, it is formatted uppercase L, lowercase a, uppercase T, lowercase e, uppercase X. And in LaTeX, because it's a text formatting language, to make it fancy, they even have a tag for this that makes superscript and subscript forms of some of these letters in the word, just to show off that it's a text formatting language. Anyway, why you need to do this is you need some way to, for example, make things italic, or you need some ways to make the headers of a chapter bigger, a first level header bigger than the second level header, that sort of thing. While you could certainly select text and increase the font or decrease the font or bold or not bold, that's cumbersome. And so what LaTeX allows you to do is just like HTML does for a website, is it allows you to say, this is a header, this is a chapter, this is a paragraph, and this paragraph shouldn't be indented, or just with fairly minimal markup. And it allows you to say what this text is. This is a code block. And by saying what it is in a separate file, and there's all these great templates out there for this, it makes it very fast to say, for LaTeX to then go through and compile your document and take all of your hints about what something is and apply all of the formatting that's necessary to that, knowing that it's a header or knowing it's a code block or whatever. It also does great things like automatically adds page numbers to everything in the right place. It automatically reads all of the headers and generates table of contents for you. You can even tag certain elements and say that I want this to be in the index. This particular section should be in the index under this name, and it will automatically compile and build indices for you in the back of your book. All of this stuff, it dramatically increases the speed at which you can format text once you climb the learning curve, like anything like this. But yeah, it's incredibly powerful. It's used a lot in academia. It's used less outside of that, but it's used by a lot of people. I mean, I formatted my resume in LaTeX after I climbed the learning curve. I found this really great template for resumes that I formatted. And it's because it's all based in text. If you can type relatively quickly, it's just incredibly powerful and very fast compared to having to get your hands off of home row and go grab a mouse and select text.
Yep. You spoke earlier about doing some of your formatting in markup. Is there a tool to convert markup to LaTeX? I'm
sure there is, but in practice, I haven't done that. So it's possible that it's because there's just more. Once you get to the formatting phase, the markdown that I use is so lightweight and it's fairly minimal. It's just like this is a header, etc. That I found it's because I need to, in the formatting part of the process, I'm also doing another round of editing, sort of, because I have to read every word that I've written so I can see how I need to format, if there's something I need to format or add an index for or whatever. And so I'm already kind of reading through the text anyway. So changing two hash signs into a LaTeX /section or subsection, using that formatting is not a huge deal at that point. So yeah, there are tools. There's tools that can convert back and forth between LaTeX and all the other markup in languages you can think of. I just personally don't tend to use it. I go through sort of when I'm in that frame of mind and do it manually.
Sure. And I've got to ask you, when you do you do versioning on your books as you're writing them? And really the question here is, do you use Git in writing your books?
I didn't used to, but more recently, my projects, because I could, essentially, I have. I haven't had the trouble case that you would think you would really need this for, which is I deleted something or made a mistake, or I need to go back to a previous revision. For the most part, any mistakes or problems or something that you just sort of roll ahead with, I haven't yet needed to roll back on something. How's that? But I like the safety net, I suppose, of having that. And so I've started trying to do that. So for example, how to write a tech book, it has its own little Git repository locally on my machine. And it's all in. Every time I would complete a chapter, I would, commit a new commit with that chapter in it. So I had these milestones. I'm sure it's perfectly possible that in the future, in particular, I could see this if you were someone who made massive edits to cut material at some point later in the process, and then found that you needed some of that material back, this could be incredibly useful to do it that way.
This is great. We've got Git, we've got LaTeX, we've got markup, all working together here. I have more questions on this, but first I have to let everybody know that this episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by our friends at IT Pro TV, now called ACI Learning. In today's IT talent shortage, whether you operate as your own department or are part of a larger team, your skills must be up to date. 94% of CIOs and CISOs agree that attracting and retaining talent is increasingly critical to their roles. Access more than 7,200 hours of content available. ACI Learning consistently adds new content to keep you at the top of your game. Your team will thank you for entertaining training. ACI Learning's completion rate is 50% higher than their competitors. ACI Learning is excited to introduce Cyber Skills, a solution to future-proof your entire organization, not just the IT department. This new cybersecurity training tool is for all members of your organization. It's cybersecurity awareness training for non-IT professionals. With Cyber Skills, get flexible, on-demand training covering everything from password security and phishing scams to malware prevention and network safety. Your employees will stay motivated and engaged throughout their learning process with easy to follow material. With a simple 1 hour course overview, your employees gain attack specific training and knowledge check assessments based on common cyber threats they will encounter on a daily basis. They'll also gain access to bonus courses, documentary style episodes, so your employees can learn about cyber attacks and breaches in their own style. ACI Learning helps you invest in your team and trust them to thrive while increasing the entire security of your business. Boost your enterprise cybersecurity confidence today with ACI Learning. Be bold, train smart. Visit go.acilearning.com/twit. Twit listeners will receive at least 20% off or as much as 65% off an IT Pro Enterprise Solution plan. The discount is based on the size of your team, and when you fill out their form, you will receive a proper quote tailored to your needs. Okay, so Kyle, you've written what, 10 books now, including this book on how to write books?
It's a even dozen now. So 10 of them were
with 12 of them.
Yeah, so it's.
Are you going to lose count at some point?
it's only I only know because I keep like a personal bibliography on my site to sort of keep track of that. But yeah, it's probably important to note that we've talked a lot about self-publishing aspects of this, like LaTeX, but a lot of that only comes in when you're self-publishing, and the majority of the book is really about working with traditional publishers, because I'm aiming this towards someone who wants to write their very first tech book, and I recommend against a first-time book writer trying to do all of it themselves and go fully the self-publishing route. I strongly recommend, if you're writing your first tech book, that you do work with the traditional publishers. There's a lot of reasons for that. I go into that in detail. I have many paragraphs explaining why I feel this way. But in summary, it comes down to it's already challenging enough to write your first book. There's a big learning curve you need to climb. And editors in the publisher can help guide you through that process. And a good editor is just invaluable when you're working on your first book. And it's a big project. And so if you're taking on your first project, and then on top of all of that, you also have to learn the whole publishing industry, self-publishing side of it. It can be a lot. I'm not saying that no one should do that for their first book. I've been just recommending against it. I really think it's beneficial to see how it's done with a traditional publisher before you decide to go it alone.
So, having co-written one book, contributed to a number of books, and written another book entirely by myself, which took a couple of years, every one of them wanted the document given to them in Word. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that if you're an open source person?
Well, and that's
kind of converted to. Well, I'm just curious. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, and that's common. That's a common, like we're mentioning formatting in LaTeX, but the reality with a traditional publisher is, while some publishers will accept LaTeX, for the most part, they all have very standard Word doc templates. And so when you are ready to do the formatting stage, which is to do all of that extra markup we've been talking about, you use their template, because they all have, the goal for them is for you to mark up the text in Word according to what it is. This is a code block, this is a note, this is a header, etc. This is a figure. And then that gets converted to something that the actual page layout person can take and put into something like Adobe InDesign or something else and create a print-ready proof out of. But this is sort of the intermediary form. So what happens is you will get a Word doc, but all the publishers I've worked with have also offered some form of LibreOffice alternative, because they know they're in tech publishing and a lot of their writers work from Linux and don't have a copy of Word. And so all of the ones I've worked with over the years have offered some alternative to the Word template, like a LibreOffice version that does similar things, and it seemed to work fine. My process has still always been to separate formatting from writing. I feel that's very important. I feel strongly that's important, because it's a separate part of your brain, and formatting really does take you out of the writing. So I always write my first drafts in text with, like I said, limited markdown, language formatting. And then the second phase, if I'm using with a traditional publisher, is I paste that into a Word document, and then go through the process of using a mouse, selecting text, and then picking whatever. They all have style guides that are separate and unique. So you follow their style guide and their examples to mark each of those sections of the text accordingly to, using their template, which is like this. It's like a program unto itself on top of Word or on top of LibreOffice.
I want to say before, I know Jonathan has some questions queued up, but I have it's not so much a word hack. It was more like a command given to me, but it was really worthwhile. Which is that if there's a stage of this that is going to be Word, and if you're going to be writing in Word, starting with the outline view there, which by the way is one of the worst ever invented. It's absolutely horrible in the extreme, very hard to figure out. But if you get the outline thing right in the first place, that will generate your table of contents. And that's really important because that helps you nav around the document. Also, you can have a navigation bar on the left that is the outline of the thing you're writing. And so you know where you are in it. And you can actually move parts around in that. So a minor word hack, I'm not recommending using Word, but if you're forced to be there, that's some hard-earned wisdom. So with that, Jonathan, you take over.
Sure. So I'm intrigued that your recommendation is to go with the traditional publisher first. And the reason that that's interesting to me is I've always had this impression that it's very difficult to break into that world as somebody that's, unknown or maybe known from writing source code. What's the process to make the jump to, who do you email and say, hey, I'd like to write a tech book? How do you get that first shoe in the door?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's chapter 3. Basically, I go through in detail, but to summarize chapter 3, you start with a really solid book pitch. And so that is explaining the book to a publisher in the language that they expect. And all of the major tech publishers will give you guidelines on how to pitch them. And in the book, I link to all of the major ones that I could find guidelines for with hyperlinks. So you can go and see what format they want things in. But in essence, what they want is a couple of paragraph introduction to the book. They want an explanation about why the book should exist and what you're trying to do with the book and explain the market for it, for instance, and what's unique about your book. So if there's existing books on the market, why yours should exist, why yours is going to be different, and then follow the outline. So the outline will then show that you know what you're talking about. You have thought thoroughly about the organization of the book, and you have a cohesive book here, and you have a book-length thing. That's the other benefit of writing a good outline, even before the pitch, is that it confirms to you that you have a full-size book. If you only have an outline that has 3 chapters in it, maybe you don't have a full book in this topic, or you have to expand the topic. You start off by taking your outline and turning it into a book pitch. There's a couple of things that you add to a really good outline at the beginning and end, like a little bit of market analysis, an explanation of who you are. It's sort of like applying for 2 jobs. You're applying for the job of author, and you're also applying for the job of tech expert, because you have to convince them both that you don't have to, another question is, how much expertise do I need to write a book? You don't have to be the foremost authority on a topic to write a book. I've never been the foremost authority on a topic that I've written a book about when I've approached a publisher. I've been very competent and very experienced in the topic. And what's more important is that you have enough experience in the topic that you can explain it well to a beginner. That's way more important than being the foremost authority on a topic, because there's plenty of foremost authorities who do a poor job of explaining how to do whatever they can do. Mm-hmm. So you identify, you create that book pitch, and then you choose which publishers. And there's a lot of different criteria that go into which publisher you may want to use. But once you choose 1 or 2 publishers to approach, then you follow their process, and I include links for how to approach them. And publishers are always looking for new authors. That's the other thing. While it seems like there's some secret handshake, really it just has to do with the fact that they can, if they're going to a conference, or an editor's going to a conference trying to find an author for a topic, they're going to start by approaching the people that have a name in that topic, just because they're trying to find someone with authority on it to write about it. Mm-hmm. But they're always looking for, new authors that they can bring in to write about topics. I mean, I got my first book simply because O'Reilly was looking to write a book about Knopics, which was this great live CD back in the day. Mm-hmm. And I happened through, and I go through the story in chapter 1, but through a sequence of events, I became known by someone who happened to work at O'Reilly for having expertise in Knopics. And he just came to me one day and said, "Hey, would you like to write a book about Knopics?" And I said, sure, why not? And he said, "Okay, we'll just go to this page and follow their steps for pitching." But he knew internally that they were looking for someone to do it, and they hadn't had that lined up. And because I think of the strength of the outline and the strength of my book proposal, it showed that I had thought through the process and could do it. So yeah, that's really what it comes down to. Is it's not, while it's true that if you don't have a well-formed book pitch or you don't seem like you know what you're talking about, it might be difficult to break in. If you hit the publisher with the right idea at the right time, they're always looking to bring new people in.
So I guess the question that goes along with that is, who should consider writing a tech book? Like what are the things where you're at in your career or what you've done, the place you've come to? What are kind of the signs that you should think about? Maybe I am the right guy to write a book about, X, Y, or Z. Sure.
Yeah. So if you're obviously just learning a topic, then it's probably, unless you're a professional technical writer who knows how to learn enough to explain it to someone else, if that's not you, then everyone else, I would say when you reach a middle to almost senior level of competence in a topic, that's a good time and where you find yourself mentoring others in the topic is probably a good threshold. If you have other people coming to you and you find yourself explaining how to use this technology. So again, if you're brand new to something, then it's probably not the right time because you're still learning yourself. But you also don't have to be the foremost authority. So, if we're talking, back when systems administrators roamed the earth, and I was one, now we have 5 different names for them. But, there was like junior system administrator, and senior, right? So I would say in that context, if you would label yourself as a senior level person, that you probably have now climbed the learning curve enough on the topic and have enough competence in the topic that you're now training other junior members of your team on how to apply that technology, whatever it is. And you are probably at the phase where if you feel the urge to teach people about that, then it's a good time to write a book. I really do think that other than the desire to do it, the expertise in the topic, I mean, that's really what it comes down to write a tech book. A lot more people could do it than probably self-assess that they could.
So I have some close to closing questions. We're about 3/4 of the way through the show, and I'm going to get to those right after this break. Okay, so you've been publishing books throughout I think there's a transition that's going on from analog to digital, and we live in an almost entirely digital world here. I mean, this is what happened. What we're doing right now is what happened to television and to radio at the same time, because we're both in video and in audio, and this wouldn't have been around 30, 40, 50 years ago. And now it's almost a standard way to communicate if you're doing broadcast, or what used to be broadcast. So with publishing, there's I spend a lot of time in libraries. There's no shortage of books. Talking about breaking into publishing, an awful lot of people have done it. But how do you see the publishing industry now, where some of it's digital? You talked about the joy really of feeling and having like a hardcover book, a serious book. We all want to have bookshelves. I got some really tiny ones behind me for those who can see them, but that's part of what's scattered across 3 homes. But I like having books around. We all most of us like having books around. What do you think is happening to the business now and to the field? Libraries too are kind of going through a similar set of issues. Like what do they become?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of answers there, because there's one tech industry focused one, because tech publishing is sort of an entity unto itself. And that's one reason I wrote the book, is that there are plenty of books on how to write a nonfiction book or how to write a fiction book, but tech publishing is a completely different industry. There's completely different imprints and publishers in that industry that focus just on tech books. So where tech books are going, I think there's still I think that while there have been periods of time where there's been, ebbs and flows in the popularity of tech publishing, there's always a need to learn from an expert the things you need to know to be competent in a subject, in particular in tech, because you find as you go through a career, there's always a need to get new skills and tools to advance your career if you're interested in advancing your career. And while there are certainly ways that you can do that, say for free online by just reading the documentation that people might put up, the challenge with that is the documentation sometimes is either just covers every topic and not necessarily just what you need to know, or it's not necessarily professionally done, or more importantly, it's not necessarily curated. So one of the great things about a good tech book is that you're getting curated information, just the things that you actually need to know to become competent in a topic, all in one place, so that if you want to change careers or just expand your career and learn this new technology that other people are using, you can get a book, read it through, and if it's a good tech book, feel competent in that. Now, the thing about switching over to ebooks is there's a benefit separate from, like say, fiction and other nonfiction. For tech in particular, I'm of two minds about it. I'm old school. I mean, behind me, you see a bunch of old mechanical calculators, right? So I clearly like sort of old-fashioned things sometimes. But and I like the feel of a tangible book. I like the smell of old books. I kind of collect certain old books myself. Mm-hmm. So I like physical books. I like all of my books that I read physical books. However, I also understand the value of, in particular for tech books, having the ebook option, because there's often large code blocks that you need to copy and paste, right? And so that's super valuable and that's it's a good reason to have both. And I like that certain publishers are making a point to offer both options. Like, for example, I know with No Starch, if you buy a print copy, you also get the ebook sent to you, so you have the benefit of both.
So I've got to ask real quick, because you've definitely gotten the gears whirring in my mind. I do a lot of writing over at Hackaday. All of my stuff is short form. I have some series, but they're still, you put them all together and they're short. How do you go from, and maybe it's just that the topics I work with don't fit, but how do you make the jump from writing short form stuff to long form? How do you get, from an article or two to the point of being able to fill up a book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, on average, let's say that your average article is somewhere between 600 and 1,200 words, right? Some articles go over that, obviously, but at least for Linux Journal, when I was writing a column there, on average, it was 600 to 1,200 words. Mm-hmm. And a page in a book is about 400 words, 400 to 500 words, it depends, right? So you could think of like an average article would maybe be 3 pages in a book. And your average tech book is 150 pages minimum, right? So that sort of gives a sense of what's involved. So how you make the transition by picking a topic that is definitely much larger than you would fit into an article, or even like a 3-parter or a 4-parter. Now, that said, a 4-part article series on a topic would be a pretty good start for a chapter on that topic. Mm-hmm. So when I found myself creating a book out of my old Linux Journal articles, for instance, what I ended up doing was collecting all the ones that I thought were still relevant. And what I found was some commonality on a lot of the topics. For the most part, I was writing about systems administration in some way, or something that would be beneficial from that standpoint. So I realized at least the first book I would write that was a combination of these articles would be focused on that. So that was like step 1. Which of these articles would I set aside? And then step 2 was then looking and saying, well, some of these have common topics, and not everything fit perfectly into a mold. But for the most part, I could see patterns emerge among the topics that allowed me to split things up into a couple of different categories. And then those became chapters, essentially. Now, as someone who wants to write a book from scratch, say, again, I keep going back to the outline because that's just so critical. That's where that comes in, right? It's you start thinking about what you would want to write a book about, and you start outlining it, and you start looking at the topics that you would want to cover, and you start with a big vision, and then you write the outline and see where you are with that, and then you may have to trim it or you may have to expand it depending on whether you feel like you have a book-sized thing there. And that's also where traditional publishers can come in. You can pitch them a topic, and they might say, "This is great, except we think that it would be better if we maybe expand the scope to include XYZ, or shrink the scope so that it's focused on this particular area, because otherwise it'd be too giant of a book." So yeah, traditional publishers can also really help with something like to help guide you into expanding your topic into a book length form.
Doc was just saying on the back channel, and I think this is interesting. He was told that 35 to 40,000 words is what publishers are looking at these days. Yeah,
I was actually at a thing last week at Harvard where there are a bunch of book writers, and one of them was saying, "Oh no, the new book length, it used to be like serious book 120,000 words, and it was down to 80,000 words. Now it's 35 to 40,000 words." And I don't know if that's true or not, but hearing that encourages me. It's like, I think of myself as a sprinter like you, not a marathon runner. And I think that's kind of a difference. No, Ant said in the back channel, "How could a sprinter become a marathon runner?" Well, they can't.
Let me qualify joke about that, Mr. Searls. Let me qualify that. A good sprinter cannot be a marathon runner.
I don't think Ant has a high opinion of marathon runners.
It's like your offensive alignment is not an eligible receiver. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, some of this follows a trend that you see in tech publishing, where there have been and there still are some publishers that really focus. There used to be that you would judge a book by how thick it was on a subject. And you saw this, there's a lot of series that would add the word Bible to the title, right? Like, this is the Bible on this topic. And what it basically meant was they were publishing documentation, unedited, just, the goal was to get the thickest possible book, the most pages. And so you would have these tomes that didn't necessarily teach you what you needed to know necessarily, but it documented everything in paper form. So you'd have this 500-page book on a topic. And there are certainly some 500-page tech books I have that are exhaustive on the topic and are incredibly valuable. But for the most part, the more valuable books were those that didn't go the more pages is better route. And instead, what does it take to explain this topic thoroughly and completely, but succinctly?
So I've got to jump in and just real quick make a point. The reason that the publishing the Bible for, give your tech subject doesn't work anymore, it's not practical. We have the internet. All this documentation is on the internet. You can go look it up. We don't need to publish all the documentation because nobody needs to carry around the physical book of documentation. But what does make sense is to get somebody who's kind of handheld guide through, or, here's my thoughts on, or here's a tutorial on. And of course, some of that exists on the internet too. But you no longer need to publish all of the documentation. You can just Google for it.
Exactly. Yeah. What you need instead is some curation of that documentation. It says, would you like to learn how to do X? Here's what it takes, and here's some examples, and here's things that are practical. And let me guide you through this as though we were working together at a company and I was showing you what I know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking, well, the internet has a lot of documentation, but a lot of that is also going to be wrong. The reason that AI hallucinates is because half the internet is wrong, and it's trained on it. So I don't know where that takes us. But let me just
it takes us to the editing.
You're about to say something.
I was going to say it takes us to the editing phase, right? Because that's what. Even, my drafts that I finish aren't perfect. Once I finish my first draft, there's a whole process of editing and tech editing that go into making a book correct. Because even if I thought something that I wrote was clear and correct, the only way to really know is to have a tech editor come through and try everything that I said themselves and then either understand it correctly and everything worked great, or there was some variation on their system that made it not work and I need to factor that in, or it's unclear or things like that. And I made a mistake and it's incorrect. There's some typo or something that breaks the command or whatever it is. And that's another big factor compared to documentation online where, someone may type it up or copy and paste things in, but maybe not has vetted it yet or tested it for correctness.
Yeah. So we're down really at the end of the show here. I'm looking at the clock, and we always ask. I don't know, John, you always have one question at the end, and so I don't know if you want to go for that or not.
I usually ask people what the weirdest thing that they've seen someone do with their open source project is, and we usually get some fun answers. I don't know, the iteration of that might work here is, what's the weirdest book idea that you've ever thought of?
Oh wow, yeah, I had a book idea one time that. Pretty off the wall, where I thought about doing a complete geek's guide to brewing and distilling, where it would walk through not just the process of how to brew beer or cider or any of that sort of thing, but also go the step further in how to distill that into spirits, but also in addition to that, because it needs to be legal, the process of getting licensed to do that legally, and what all of that entails. But I started doing research into what all of that entails, and it turns out I don't have the spare property and the time and expense and all of that stuff to actually go through that process myself in the United States, at least. So I kind of canned that idea. But yeah, that's probably the weirdest one. Was I thought there's so many like brewing geeks out there and geeks that also do that sort of thing as a hobby, because it meshes so well, all the chemistry and everything, that it would be good to write something that not just says how to do it, but why you do it this particular way and what's the science behind it. I thought that would be appealing.
Well, I'm kind of surprised that you didn't go straight to something you actually did, which is the Tempest nested knitting clock. Which I just put in our back channel, and I don't know but I mean, tell us about that as briefly as you can, because I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I in January, I saw this Hackaday post about this artist who created a clock that knits a scarf over the course of a year. It does a row, it does a stitch an hour, a row a day, and at the end, it drops down a scarf on the floor. And I thought, that's incredible. I want one of those. And I went to their site, and they said, you can commission one from me. And I said, oh, well, if you have to commission it, you can't afford it. So I need to figure out how to make one, because I want one of those. And I figured, well, it can't be that hard. What is it? It's a stepper motor, it's a knitting machine, and some sort of computer to control it. And so that started me down this rabbit hole where within a couple of weeks, I actually had a functioning prototype that then after a couple of more weeks, I changed into a smaller knitting machine and learned crash course in 3D design and ended up making one from scratch. And then on my site, I go through that whole process. I decided to do a full write-up, probably a 4,000 to 6,000 word write-up, step by step, with all of my source code shared and all of the steps shared and all the 3D models shared. So now, fantastic. I have a 2023 scarf that has stripes. What I did is I customized it. So I have a black scarf, but as something special happens in the year, or bad or good, I changed the color to add a stripe to mark that event. And so now I'm most of the way through the year, and I have a very colorful scarf because a lot of things have happened this year that documents 2023 for me.
That is exceptionally cool. I'm glad we worked it in. But we are at the end, or maybe beyond. So very quickly, what's your favorite text editor and scripting language, even if you've already said some of that?
All right. Well, it's Vim. It's Vim all day long. I've been using Vim forever. And probably Bash. I probably find myself using Bash more than anything else.
I never know what's gonna get the bell, but the bell does show up. What will trigger the bell? Okay, Kyle, thanks so much, man, for being on the show, and we'll definitely have you back.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
You have to show a scarf next time too.
Yeah.
So, Jonathan, that was good.
Oh, that's great. That was a lot of fun.
Now, are you going to write a book?
I've thought about it in the past. There's a lot of there's questions that would need to be answered, like what Hackaday would feel about me writing a book and maybe using some of the articles that have been published there. But if I really come across a winner of a topic, it might be a thing that'll happen.
write, are you still the owner and you're granting them a copyright, or are they the owners of the things that you write?
You know, I'm not actually sure exactly how that's set up. But even above and beyond that, I would want to clear it with them first and get their opinion on the idea. But yeah, that is a good question, and I'm sure you have a part in the book where it talks about copyright and licensing and all those things.
I do. Yeah, that's in
the. You had another 10 minutes to go into that.
Yeah, that's in chapter 3 when you're pitching, and I have a whole section on the book contract and things to look out for in the book contract.
I want to know how many more books get sold because of this show. So it's time for you to do your plugs, Jonathan, and we're already plugged the heck out of Hackaday, but why not?
Okay, so there's Hackaday. Security article goes live every Friday morning. There's also the Untitled Linux Show, which is a Club Twit exclusive. And if you're not on Club Twit, you really should. It's basically the price of a fancy cup of coffee per month. I mean, come on. You get access to the Discord. You get access to ad-free shows. You get access to cool shows like the Untitled Linux Show. We have a blast there. That is basically it. You can buy me a coffee if you want to over at buymeacoffee.com, but just consider that a tip jar. But that's it. And boys, it was great to be here.
So I get to plug next week. It's Michael Hoffman, known as Hoff, at Spatial Computing and AI and open source stuff. And you can find out more about him in advance at iqxr.com. So anyway, that's coming up next week. Until then, I will remain Doc Searls, and this will remain Floss Weekly. We'll see you then.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club Twit. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club Twit Discord, a great clubhouse for Twit listeners. And finally, the Twit Plus feed with shows like Stacy's Book Club, the Untitled Linux Show, the Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit. And thanks for your support.